your patience as we get organized. I'm going to do my best to keep these thought leaders short and sweet so that we get you out of here by 6:30. As you know, I'm Tracy Penny-Light. I'm a panelist, but I'm not going to talk too much. I'm just going to facilitate today. Kate Coleman, who is our colleague at the University of Melbourne in Australia, has convened this panel. Really because she, as she said to me, she was interested in the hive mind, exploring some questions that she's really interested in. So really these questions will be an opportunity for you to hear a conversation amongst the panelists about their thoughts on these different topics. So as you know, Dan Hickey is just to my right. Kerri Lemoie, sorry, I just did it. Sorry, Kerri. Kerri Lemoie, you probably know, who does lots of badge work. Presant, Patsie, Bernard Bull, and then, of course, Serge, Ravet. So, just as a way of starting off some of the things, we can go to the next one, Dan. Digital badges really have the potential to make learning more visible. There's Kate you see Kate there on the top. They can work alongside and on top of and in front of our current career and accreditation ecosystems. And also, as Kate always notes, have the capacity to connect these accreditation and recognition systems and allow the learner to narrate and curate their learning experiences and knowledge for a range of audiences. We also know that open digital badges have the potential to, I probably don't even need to say this, and this is the next slide, Dan, recognize specific achievements, explicitly recognize the steps toward achievement and growth, acknowledge non-formal learning through knowledge acquisition and competency, and help speed the shift from credentials that simply measure seat time to ones that more accurately measure competency. And I think that in a lot of the work that we're doing, really what and this is Kate's terminology, in some ways we're trying to jailbreak the degree, because that idea of the credit hour doesn't necessarily, or we hope won't hold forever, and we'll be able to start designing learning experiences in new and innovative ways. So the first question that she was interested in hearing the panel's thoughts on is, what's the place of the portfolio of evidence in this mix of work? Does anyone on the panel want to start?
I'll start by elaborating on some of the comments that Kate put in her proposal. I'm going to just go back. I can't get the presenter view. So this is a really nice framing, and she thinks quite deeply, and we've talked about this quite a bit. Skipping ahead a little bit. However, unless we include the discussions around warranting of evidence, competing functions, consequential validity, credential creep, credentialism, and the current philosophical direction of the tools, the pace of adoption increases. So I think we can just turn it over to the panel with those topics. That's really what we had in mind. Those are the kinds of issues. So we can just put it up.
Yeah, John.
For me, as somebody who's been coming to these conferences, these ePortfolio conferences for years, when I first heard about open badges, for me, I just thought ePortfolios, and I think Serge agreed, and that's why they've grown so rapidly, I think, in this conference, because they represent a very accessible way to get into ePortfolios. That said, open badges themselves are not ePortfolios, and I think there's a synergistic way that they support each other, so that you can use an ePortfolio to challenge, or a chunk of an ePortfolio, a targeted evidence package to basically challenge for an ePortfolio. That ePortfolio can come back into, that badge can come back into your ePortfolio and support a new story you might want to build. And so you can basically build up through that virtuous circle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, other thoughts on the panel? Portfolios in this mix?
I might just add to that. When talking about the portfolio, I think we have to understand the concept of displaying certain types of identities for people as well, and how those badges may speak to those identities. And what that means, like if I'm a research scientist, if I'm writing a profile for a grant, I present myself very different to what I would as an academic or as someone searching for potential jobs somewhere else. So again, linking the portfolio space for a particular purpose and that badge and what that represents is very important.
Bernard?
So as I look at this, I see credentials and what shows up in portfolios. All of them are they're all just cultural artifacts. And we use these cultural artifacts to learn to tell stories about ourselves and to build connections with people through those stories, people who resonate with our stories. And one of my great concerns is for young people and all sorts of people who live in this new digital and connected world who don't discover this reality of storytelling and cultural artifacts. And as a result, they find themselves frustrated and stuck and incapable of achieving their goals and tackling the problems that mean a great deal to them in their lives. And so what interests me in this new landscape as we're exploring these them as new devices that equip people to tell stories in different ways. And I'm hopeful that these new devices will create this as new types of devices and technologies have advanced to help people tell stories in new ways on film. We're helping people tell stories in their lives.
Serge?
The image we have about a portfolio of evidence is to have some kind of container with evidence. The thing is, evidence are connected. A piece of evidence connects me to a place, to an ID, to people I've been working with. And I think maybe the metaphor of the portfolio is not the right one, because it tends to show walls. Well, it should be about connections. So a portfolio of evidence, maybe another term for that.
Follow up on that?
Yeah.
Just kind of building on what I said before, and I was talking to a couple of colleagues about this before the panel, but portfolios actually historically come before credentials in education. They existed before diplomas were a standard form of issuance. If we go to Harvard University, for its first 170 years, it did not issue diplomas to its graduates. You could get a diploma, but it was a special circumstance. What would happen after you graduated, if you found yourself in need of that kind of artifact to connect with another person, you would hire a person to create your diploma for you. So every diploma was actually personalized. You could choose your own style and the messaging and so forth. You would then set a meeting with the president of Harvard and meet with him and pay him a fee, and he would then endorse your diploma that you created, or he would sign it. And so that was sort of the emergence there. But prior to that, by the way, there were also other cultural factors at play. At the first graduation at Harvard University, the way in which diplomas, there was a book that was handed to them. It was sort of a symbolic book of their learning, but it was actually taken back after the ceremony. They didn't get to keep it. And the order in which people graduated and they were called up was actually based upon the prestige and influence of their family and their past, their name. So I'm certainly hopeful that we're coming to a new era where that's not the way in which things happen. But notice how that's all so deeply connected to culture, right? And beliefs and values and norms. And portfolios then really were called portfolios, but the way that in which people built relationships prior to all of these credentials that we think of today was by the quality of their work and the nature of their connections with people and groups and other people. And in essence, that's what portfolios grew out of today, was just sort of a codifying of what we've done for centuries.
Awesome. So maybe that leads us to the next question, because you talk about the transcript really as this cultural artifact and the emergence of those early portfolios. What alternatives are there today to traditional and formal credentials, and how might they be particularly critical in serving life-wide learning and life-wide learners?
I'll take a shot at that one. I want to refer back to Giancarlo's point about this notion of what was the term used for collateral credentials. Right. So for me, ePortfolios and badges are actually, they serve this really key function because they can transform the kind of stuff that many of us care about. I don't think we should be treating those sort of so-called 21st century blah, blah, blah as collateral credentials. That should be the credential. If we focus directly on those kinds of learning outcomes, which can be represented so nicely, these more informal, which I prefer to the probably a better language, the more formal outcomes, the easily measured outcomes, that's what we should be treating as the collateral credentials. Because those are the things that we really run a huge risk of what measurement specialists call construct relevant variance, which the rest of us just call teaching to the test. It's a massive problem in education. It's a massive problem with formal credentials. So to me, it's the coupling is what matters. If we focus directly and don't treat those as collateral credentials, but in portfolios, and particularly in ePortfolios, they can represent all of this stuff, and it's learning that occurs on a relatively shorter time scale, to use Jay Lemke's notion. Then there's other stuff, that's achievement that accrues over really longer time scales, but can be formally measured, that presents this huge problem to teaching to the test. It's that coupling of those two together that I think is really where the progress can be.
Well, and I think that's where learners sometimes are really challenged by the notion of a portfolio, because it's not assessed in the same way as an exam would be or a paper would be, and it's hard to and for teachers as well, it's hard to wrap your head around how would you really measure whether a student has achieved a particular set of things in order to move to the next level.
The key point then is if you treat more formal outcomes, measurable things that are traditionally treated as achievement that a lot of people care about, that's the outcome of the ePortfolio culture. Don't try to measure the ePortfolio. You can't measure an ePortfolio. It only tells you what someone did. There's these other things that you can measure quite readily, that if we treat those as the collateral outcome and make sure that when we engage in ePortfolios, that this other stuff that we also care about is sort of coming along for free. We get both of those things, and we solve this huge problem with teaching.
That really speaks to something that I've been trying to frame for myself for a while, and that is, people talk about portfolios of learning, portfolios for learning, portfolios are learning as a narrative, learning as a conversation. There's something that Teresa, I just had her name in my head, Warwick University language, and she was at the Badge UK conference. And I was watching the video because I was unfortunately not able to make it there. And she was talking about learners being more focused on being able to reflect on their learning through the badges and being able to answer those questions. It's almost like a ongoing behavior-based interview saying, tell me a time when, and you'd be able to bring up that story and talk about how it relates to the various 21st century outcomes.
Well, I think that's the thing, right? It's not just about achieving the credential, it's about being able to reflect on and speak to articulate what skills and abilities you've got as a result of earning that credential, right? Yeah. So as learning occurs in more places leading to a diversity of formal and informal recognition mechanisms, to what degree might learners and communities manage their own credentials and put the data to work connecting them with the education, civic involvement, or self-employment opportunities that they seek? Anyone? Yeah, Patsie.
Right, so I think it's what we were talking about at this conference. It's about making explicit the currency of those credentials to employers, stakeholders, community, and so on. So without that explicit understanding of what the credential means, it's not really going to be valuable, in short. So again, that culture of recognition has to come really strongly. It has to really start developing, and the different capabilities have to be made explicit. So badges could be.
So, by the way, we should mention that Carla Cassili was supposed to be on this panel. Her mother passed away. She was unable to join us, which is terrible, and we're sad. She really provides an important voice, but also we're really hoping that Kerri could also comment on this, because we're very excited about the forthcoming 2.0 standards in using linked data, and I'm pretty confident that you teach us quite a bit about that relative to this.
Sure. I mean, when I think of ePortfolios, I think of them as a container for evidence, and they're also a container for badges. The badges are to be in the portfolios. The badges themselves can contain evidence, and right now in the most recent spec, the 1.1, there's a link in the evidence, there's a link in the badge, right, that link to an evidence, which may link to a portfolio page. So you have this interaction between the two. But instead of, a badge is really meant to be a portable thing. So it's not just sitting in a portfolio, but it can be used in other aspects. And in the 2.0 specification, what we've been talking about, and Serge made a reference to this as well, is actually embedding the evidence directly in the badge data. So that you're not just linking to one page that may contain 2 photos, a video, written context, any of that. Instead, it could be embedded directly in there, and not just embedded in there, but maybe tagged and maybe permissions, so the earner can control which evidence they actually want to show in the badge. So I think there's a close intersection between the two, and if you think about what the evidence is and how that applies, it's probably right now the most underutilized aspect of badges, and it's the thing that closely ties together badges and portfolios.
Kerri, can I just follow with another question? Could the learner then include reflection as part of the evidence that came, their reflection on the evidence that's in the badge as well as part of the evidence? Because it's,
Sure.
Do you know what I mean?
I suspect that happens in a lot of the platforms now, where students are writing up their reflections, and it's just a link on a web page. Mm-hmm. But instead, it could be part of the portability of the badge data in the 2.0 version.
That'd be awesome. Serge?
Yes, it's about the reflection. Reflection can take many different forms. Mm-hmm. It's not necessarily reflective writing.
Right.
A dancer who is studying choreography, jump for sides, and would interact, is reflecting. If you look at Master Chef, the chef is reflecting. And there is not necessarily reflective learning, reflective writing. And so the question, my position about judging if there is reflection, if you want to assess if reflection happens, is the same as, I mean, particularly that is the same as what I've learned about competitive education. Is how do you assess knowledge? My understanding, my experience as a professional is you infer knowledge based on performance evidence. Because you have been able to do this and that, I, as an assessor, infer, it's an inference that you have this knowledge. And maybe I'll question the knowledge. I think maybe we should consider the same about reflection, that someone can be reflective by, you can observe that person and say, obviously you're affected because the way you dance that piece is very different this time than the other time. And there might be a writing. Not even necessarily verbalization, not in the sense of the reflection. So I think there's a bit of this injunction of you need to reflect and we need to see a piece of reflection. Well, maybe we should be more open. And that leads me to the idea of recognition. Because the idea of recognition is looking at the other person and try to extract from the other person the information we want to get. So it's more about pull and forcing the person to do the things that you want the person to do. So I think as if you want to recognize someone, you should be able also to recognize reflection when it happens.
I think what I meant was reflective thinking, not reflective writing, and evidence of that. But yeah, I think you're right on, Dan.
So this is a huge passion of mine, is this use of reflection as evidence, and I feel pretty strongly that it's a mistake to try to use reflection as evidence of knowing. Reflection can be very good evidence of engagement. In fact, in my own coursework, almost all of the points students gain, 70% are for their reflections on their engagement. And I find it works. There's a very nice balancing of formative and summative functions. The reflections are worded, the prompts are worded in such a way that you can't really respond to them if you haven't engaged. And so, to use the anthropological notion of prolepsis, if you get it right with reflection, you set up the engagement so that they can give the reflection that they know they'll need to get the points. And I guess I also want to add one other thing to that, to this previous question is, and we'll talk about this at MozFest on Saturday, is this notion of ownership. There's a notion of boundary objects that comes out of anthropology, Bowker and Starr in particular. And probably the best example of that I've ever found is the way that, and that refers to the way that a badge is plastic. It can move around in different social spaces without losing its meaning and gaining additional meaning along the way. And a perfect example of that is an learner building a portfolio, having badges associated with it. Those badges then being able to be stacked in a learning management system where they can be associated with grades, instructor feedback, therefore privacy protection, that portfolio still lives out there and it still has its meaning. The badge still lives out there and has its meaning. But once that URL, once that earner decides to paste the URL into a grade book or a competency map, so it can move around in those spaces. And to me, that's probably one of the most important evidential functions of badges, is that they're able to do that.
John?
I'm going to say what I thought Serge was going to say, which is that I think there's a largely ignored life of the badge after issue, and that evidence can certainly be inside a badge, and that can be part of the spec, but there's no way, not all the evidence can be in the badge, especially after it's issued. So that evidence might be other badges that are related, might be other content in the ePortfolio, might be what other people think about the badge, the third-party endorsements that build up over time, et cetera, et cetera.
So don't you think that that is a way of knowing, though? I mean, if you bring all of those badges together in a particular, I mean, yes, it might be evidence of engagement, but it seems to me that it's also evidence of knowing, because that learner, as they develop their abilities, their identity, they may stack those badges together in different ways, for different audiences, for different purposes. To me, that's a reflective activity in and of itself, yes? Cool. So if universities aren't necessarily recognizing these kinds of non-traditional, non-formal credentials, what should we, how are we going to get employers to make sense of them? How do we bring those different spaces together to ensure that these are going to be valuable forms of credentialing?
I'll let others answer the question to scale, but I'll answer this as an employer for a moment. I have a team of about 80, and whenever we interview, I love interviewing. In fact, I consider that to be one of my most important responsibilities as a leader, is who we hire, the people that we add to the team, and what they contribute to it. And there certainly are credentials that are a part. However, our instructional design team consists of people with degrees in theology and graphic design and healthcare and business management and all sorts of, I think we have a couple of people with degrees in education in there too. So we intentionally actually hire instructional designers with diverse backgrounds. And we're very interested in what I call lopsided people. We want wonderfully lopsided people. We don't want well-rounded people. We want people who've sort of invested in their passions, and those parts have grown, while other parts have maybe been less attended to. And so that's intentional. As we hire people, we're building a certain kind of culture in a community. And I think that employers, certainly there are employers who are overwhelmed and they're busy and they just need to try to get the seats filled and hire people. And that's maybe where the credentials play a vetting role, where they have hundreds of applications or thousands, and they have to narrow it down to the 10 they're going to interview, and then they're going to dive in. But on the flip side, it comes back to what I was mentioning before in terms of storytelling. So the question being about non-traditional, non-formal credentials, whether universities acknowledge them or not, they're important for people as they live out their lives today. Right, so the previous question was about managing credentials, and I would argue that even more important is helping people develop an understanding of how important it is to manage your identity and manage your connections. Mm-hmm. And I started blogging 10 years ago, but really in the last 4 years, I read about 150 articles a year. So I have almost 200,000 words of content. When I need to look up something to figure out what I think about something, I actually Google myself, right? So I'll Google Bernard Bull or e-tail, and then I'll type in a topic, and I'm often amazed that I actually thought about it at some point in the past that I'd forgotten. Mm-hmm. But that also has allowed me to establish incredible connections with people that maybe even end up in my being in a panel in Bologna, Italy at some point. And that's incredibly valuable, and anyone can do that, right, as they learn to manage their identity and their connections in this digital space.
Can we, that's a great example of, your own work and the work that you're doing to build teams. Are you sharing out those stories to senior leaders and things to help them better understand this new landscape? Because I think you're right. I think people are really busy, employers and universities alike, and that may be part of the barrier and challenge to having these more widely recognized. What responsibility do we have, perhaps, to change that?
I just wanted to say that a lot of what I see of what's happening with badges and colleges and universities is almost feeding into the problem. They're more of what I would call course stickers and, gamification and sort of Wild West, what the lecturer decides is going to be fun and something to experiment with. And where I see potential traction for badges in higher education is helping students make that transition to the workplace and be able to articulate what they know and can do in the higher level AAC&U type, LEAP rubric type ways. So in other words, give me evidence that you can communicate. Give me evidence that you're a critical thinker. Talk to me about that. And I like what Deakin is doing actually in Australia with the hallmarks, where undergraduate students can challenge for an AQF level badge that says I can communicate as a bachelor graduate should. And here's the evidence, and a panel actually gives that to them, and there's no credit whatsoever attached to that. I will say too, just very quickly, just at a very practical level, that there's a story recently that Credly and a company called Learning Machine are now working badges into the admissions process for signatories to something called the Common Application.
I happen to think that the university that believes credentials will secure its future will not have a long life. I kind of resonate with what Dan, not kind of, I completely resonate with what Dan was saying before, that we can't lead with credentials. Learning organizations that are most impactful and that I have the most hope for are those that place curiosity above credentialing. Those that are deeply interested in asking the question, what does it take to nurture an incredibly deep, immersive culture of learning, not a culture of earning, right? It doesn't mean that we disregard the role of credentials. They are a reality and we can't ignore them. But those are the places that are transformational, and those are the stories that will be told of. The institution story will be told in our cultures and in our societies, and people will be drawn to them because of the richness of that culture. And I don't think this is some idealistic vision. It actually happens. We see it happening in institutions. There is the exception. There are some of these other groups that have created these wonderfully efficient pathways to getting your credential and getting out and getting a job, and I don't disregard their value or their role in the larger learning ecosystem as well. But I'm very concerned about many liberal arts and other kinds of institutions that believe that they have to actually recreate their identity. In essence, I would argue that maybe they need to go back and rediscover their identity that was rooted in curiosity and a love of learning.
Go ahead, Kerri.
What I would love to see at the university and college level is just credentials being issued throughout a course, much like they might do in MOOCs. We know that many students don't finish college, but it doesn't mean that the learning they did along the way isn't important and isn't worthwhile for employers or in any kind of learning in the context of their lives. So why wouldn't the university start, issuing credentials along the way, and then if a student doesn't finish a course, there's value there. And I understand that doesn't fit the business model of tuition and what have you, but it would be really great for the learners for
I think in 2016 it might make sense for many of us to just ask the question, will this badge get, all other things being equal, will that badge get somebody the interview? I mean, I think that's for a lot of people. One of the lures in the MacArthur badge world is that Claude Steele is on the advisory board. And somebody check me if I'm wrong, but this is how it came back to me. He was a little skeptical of badges. He was like, really? What's up with badges? And then it dawned on him that in the current climate, especially in the U.S., it's very, very difficult to give preferential treatment to anyone of color. It's almost impossible. There's so many people looking over the shoulder of admissions officials, making sure that they don't do anything that smacks of affirmative action. And so a badge should also be the person that, all other things being equal, gets somebody to nod. In busy admissions officers, a badge should be so obvious that it represents something, and they can take the time, it catches their attention, they can drill down, and the evidence speaks for itself, and it's enough to make the decision in the favor of someone who's done that work and that the evidence is there.
A badge or a collection of badges? A badge or a collection of badges?
I don't make that distinction.
What about, and this is the next question, I think picks up on all of these ideas, what about learning and evidence of learning outside of formal credentialing systems. I mean, we're talking about badges, which to me are more formal. What about learning that happens elsewhere? I mean, should we be asking for badges? Do we need to get rid of the whole thing and just really focus on the curiosity of learning and go back to, what Bernard is suggesting in terms of the history of the liberal arts for sure, but I would say what we've done at universities more broadly. Who should be warranting evidence of learning? John?
Well, I would broaden it a bit and not just make it evidence of learning and achievement maybe. And the reason I want to broaden it a bit is because I presented in Barcelona about this and we were just discussing about it again. Not all badges have to be, I took this module in the logistics course, etc. But for an organization like Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, if somebody had a badge that said IT 2010, how much else would you have to know? And how useful would that be in 2016 after the hurricane?
But if you look at that term, obviously people learned when they built it, and so the artifact can be the evidence, and could be even the picture on the badge. And we tend to dissociate that. We tend to look at things in a very analytical way. We have badges for this and this competency. But if you think that there is a team working, that built this house, that has painted these ceilings, if you give one badge, the Palazzo Community badge, to all these people, whatever they have done, and they have multiple badges like that, through proper data analysis, you'll be able to make some cross-referencing and say, because this person got stuck and the other is painting and the other, and so we might not need to have this analytical approach, and that will be something I'll mention again tomorrow, is to move from an analytical approach to assessment to an analytical approach to recognition, and say, I want someone like Dan, that's quite difficult, or like Dan. So to say, because you have these talents, you have these connections, you have these reflections, you have these readings, you have these projections, and we don't need to drill down into an analytical description of all your skills and competencies, because there are so many of them. It would make no sense at all to describe all of them. But through your connections, through what you read, what you have written, through what people have read from you, your endorsements, you will be able to infer very interesting things without having to go into an analytical approach.
So if we look at how certain elite institutions and organizations function whenever they are hunting for talent, they're searching for the right person. It's interesting. I'm sure that many people in this room have had an experience. I remember one particular Friday night when I received a cryptic email from a person who happened to work at one of the top think tanks in the United States that does a lot of lobbying behind the scenes, chaired by a well-known politician that we would all know in this room, and I thought it was like just a scam or something, right? They were trying to steal my I don't know what they were trying to do, but anyway, out of curiosity, I was willing to talk to them on a Friday night on the phone, and they contracted me to do some work, and you sign those cryptic non-disclosure forms and so forth. But the title of the subject was Noticing Your Work. And then it opened and said, we've been reading your blog. But by the way, whenever I looked this person up and found out, he was an author, he contributed a lot of policy in the U.S., I was kind of embarrassed the fact that I pay no attention to editing my work on my blog. But once I got past that, I got past that, I realized that we're in this completely different world. So what they do, what the organizations do, and many of us do, this is you're hunting for the right person, and you're looking for data about this person and stories, as I talked about before, that help indicate that this might be the right fit. And then you dig and you explore further. Right now that's limited to those who have the resources and to do that well. But now we have this world that I talked about before of learning analytics. And this is where I see the role of credentials. Because and I want as much data packed and associated with it as possible. I'm actually not too concerned about how neat and tidy it is, because I think that'll be figured out in the world when Watson takes over or whatever. But in this world of analytics, ways to kind of codify and match people and help more and more people democratize the ability to find and connect with that top talent. And by top talent, it means top talent for your organization or for you individually. That's where I see this coming together.
Do we need to worry, though, about learning analytics doing the opposite? So, sort of the evil side of learning analytics? And what do you want to say about that?
In this digital space, if Austin Kleon's little, I know it's not an academic book, but his little book, Show Your Work, he makes that claim, if it's not online, it doesn't exist, or if you're not online, you don't exist. There are haves and have-nots. As I mentioned yesterday, there will be winners and losers in this new world, and that's why I'm such a strong advocate for equipping people with the capacity to manage their own identity and develop new competencies in how to network and connect with people. Because that consists of the new haves and have-nots in this digital and connected age.
So is that, this leads really nicely into the next question, is that the role then of a life-wide or lifelong learning portfolio? Is that where this kind of thinking would be really helpful?
I certainly think so. I think that, so there's a notion of seamless cyber learning. And the cyber learning for us, for the learning sciences, is the best thing that ever happened to the learning sciences, was that the National Science Foundation initiated a brand new program that was stretched across both education and computer science. It was founded and led by leading learning scientists. And the founding document for that was 2007, which goes back a long ways before badges. And if you take a look at it, it's on the web. They introduced, and Roy P. was one of the primary authors, this notion of seamless cyber learning, and they outlined the things that would be needed for the seamless cyber learning to become a reality. And that's where the same resources are being used in informal, non-school learning, semi-formal, school-based learning outside of a course cohort where teachers are accepting work that students are doing outside of a formal structure for course credit, and formal course context where teachers are leading cohorts of students through things. And we're beginning to see that. And so the elements that document said would be needed for seamless cyber learning was very close to badges, was very close to this notion of the portfolio, and it was learning analytics. So to me, I think the pieces are there. I don't think we're there yet, but I think that was that vision that was laid out, and I think that we've made a lot of progress. If we think the credentialing system were bucky, it took 100 years to evolve alongside hiring and firing and admitting and stuff. We've probably come a long ways in 5 years.
I want to talk a little bit about the divide, and the divide I'm talking about is between those who write and those who don't. I share the panel with some prolific writers, some prolific bloggers, and I'm reflecting now about actually a blog I wrote reacting to the victim of catfishing that Jim Groom was talking about, Alan Levine, Cogdog, who basically said, I don't need no stinking portfolio, I don't need no stinking badges. Look at my work, ye mighty in despair. He's got, over 2,000 blog posts, huge following on Twitter, huge following on his blog. I think he's unusual. He's an awesome educational technologist, and I can't even compare to him. I'm a beginning blogger, and yet I have huge advantages over people who don't blog at all. And these could be people in vocational occupations who could be very intelligent, just not verbal in that way. And instead of being continual learners, I think might end up being what I would call recidivist learners. So they return to get to top up on their learning and would want to be recognized in that way. And I think those people, I think badges can help those people be recognized. And that's, for me, is what it's all about, is recognition. So recognition via Google or recognition via badges, one way or another, that's what's going to work.
Yeah, Patsie?
Can I just make a comment about the journey of that life-wide learning? I think that we've sort of not touched on the idea of self-efficacy and decision-making, and that handover point where the teacher then enables and hands that that role over to that learner, and then they make decisions and start to curate that evidence as it goes along. So we talked about that constellation and stacking of badges. I think it's important that we have to understand that the learner will grow into that by experience, and they will learn to curate that evidence as they go along. And it's very different at times, truly.
And I think, we might all aspire to be Bernard or Alan Levine or, but we're not all the same. And I think that's one of the things that portfolios and badges can really open up space for those unique identities to emerge in a perhaps more visible way than has ever been the case in the past, right? And we might just find some of those unique learners. I have a Fulbright scholar working with me right now to develop Indigenous cultural identity portfolios, because she really wants to use the portfolio as a way of helping learners to tap into their cultural heritage and to help them understand how that might shape their learning decisions and the things that they do over the course of their life. And that's a really powerful idea, I think, to sort of know thyself. Who am I? Where do my ideas and values come from? And how might that factor in? So if we really want to do that kind of work, how can we better design learning and use creative pedagogies to provide opportunities for portfolios and badges to thrive? Thoughts?
I'll give two specific ideas pedagogically that are not earth-shattering. One is, in K-12 education for the last decade, we've talked about personal learning networks, helping teachers learn about sort of the networks that they build to learn who are the people and the resources, your go-to people. Consists of mentors, it could be social media and the people and groups you connect with, and all of these different things, right? It's everything that you use to learn and to grow. I would love to see that start in year one of school, and students learn to build a network, a personal learning network, throughout the course of their entire formal education. And they'll develop this capacity to understand the value of connections. And sometimes when you have to disconnect with things and groups and people as well, they'll learn about managing their identity along the way. So I think that just that one, if we were to add that to our entire school system around the globe, it would be pretty transformational. The other one is, Kerri had this idea, I quoted him, I know yesterday, this idea of when a young person is like year one, they all get assigned some kind of concrete word. It might be a cat or waterfall or something like that. And they then, for the rest of their learning experience up through year 12, ideally become the world's leading expert on that word, or at least one of the leading experts on that word. So they study the history of cats, the biology of cats, the mythology of cats. They study cats in art. They study cats in music. And it's largely self-directed, and they begin to dig deeper and deeper and deeper, and they begin to discover things about themselves, because in school we're great at teaching people surface knowledge, and even when you major, it's not until you get to university that you learn the power of investing your time and your energy in something for countless hours and getting lost in it, right? And I think that concerns me, because I mentioned before, wonderfully lopsided people are more recognized in this new connected age. People who realize that they're feeding their strengths and not always just spending their time trying to fix their deficiencies. And so if we could explore some learning experiences early on and make that sort of an integrated part of formal education, I think those two things could be quite powerful.
Yeah, and I think, Patsie, the work that you're doing in some ways focuses on the deficiencies that the learners experience in a particular context and how they might learn from those failures or deficiencies and grow as individuals. Is this, can you speak a little bit about that pedagogical approach?
Sure. It's very interesting and complex, because what we're trying to get undergraduates to do is be research scientists. And there's a lot of failure and a lot of space to think about the failure if they choose to. So, but putting them in that position where it's okay to fail is a big deal. And then they write about it, and that's how they learn. And that's the transformative part for what I do. They come out the other side and think, that's okay. Point A didn't connect to point B, but it's going to connect to point X. And that's okay, because I can figure it out. So all of a sudden, getting those skills recognised by the learners and letting them take ownership of that is where they thrive. But making that obvious to them as they're progressing through is the hard bit. And in a research-intensive university, that marriage of the curricula with the co-curricula and the research identity and skill set is where it's at for me. So providing that platform has been the goal.
John?
I would be remiss if I didn't take the opportunity to mention the Bologna Open Recognition Declaration, because for me, ePortfolios and open badges are really all about recognition. And I think what would make these things more successful is that institutions, employers, etc., would see the benefit of recognizing and affirming the learning when they see it, not just, colleges in Canada in general have a different attitude versus universities. My experience with most universities is they don't care about recognition of learning. You know nothing. Listen to me, and in 4 years you will know something. I don't think that really cuts it anymore. And I think that affirmation is really important to people as you're building them as people. You say, I recognize you, I see that. Let's build on that. So.
Yeah, Kerri.
The technologists and badges, I kind of want to flip the question and say that there's a reason we have a metadata specification for badges, and it's so that there's an eventual connection between them. And what we've experienced in these newer years of badges is very siloed systems. And what does it look like, and how do pedagogies evolve when the badges actually get connected and from the very disparate systems? So I feel as though badges can actually help pedagogies to make learning more equitable by taking advantage of the data.
Yeah, Serge?
Yes, I might introduce that, like Kerri too. Think about the technology we have developed today around the portfolio is still very crude, extremely primitive. We have not developed the technology to help, even if we think about reflective writing, we have not developed semantic annotation, for instance. Right? It would be a wonderful tool to reflect and to able to analyze the type of discourse that people have. And it was done, as I said, Wednesday with pupils in Hong Kong. It was first ePortfolio conference in Poitiers. It is possible. It has not been done. The other thing is, this is a thought experiment I've done again and again, and I would like to share it again today, is imagine a small and medium enterprise with 100 employees, and you have 10 employees writing their CVs. I formulated the hypothesis that at the end of writing their own CV, they have also written the CV, maybe 60 or 80% of the CV of the other people. Because each time when you write your CV, you write an experience you shared with someone. So if you say, I did that with Don, so then it will go into Don's CV. Automatically, Don doesn't have to write about it. And I think if we develop the right kind of technology, we would be able, which are more social, then we'd be able to create these collective narratives. Because in fact, our narratives is a projection of the collective narrative in our own space. So why can't we have the technology to create these collective narratives?
And I think that what this panel demonstrates is the value of having these collaborative conversations to really think through how can the pedagogies be more creative as a result of the technology and vice versa. And I think there are some fantastic opportunities for all of us as we move forward in our work. Thank you to all the panelists for your great thoughts. Do we have time for questions? It's 6:30. Can we?